Here's how I view adaptations. Whenever a movie or show comes out that came from another source material, in my head, it's these producers saying, this is the best version we can make. Yes, the older material is beloved, but we feel like we can do something different enough and better enough to elevate this story to make our version the obsolete must-watch for future generations. There are 6 things to keep in mind when making an adaptation. What to keep, what to change, what to add, what to size down, how to satisfy old fans, how to introduce new fans. This technique is usually used for very recognizable media. If the fan base is big enough, they will always watch any adaptation with the most critical eye, making sure it's damn near a one-for-one copy, or else they'll disregard it as the inferior version, which is such a silly mindset.
It makes the entirely wrong sound effect. Instead of the gulping sound you hear when you drink purified water, instead it makes the sound when you drink a Nuka-Cola.
For the love of God!
One show somewhat recently that was good for old fans and new was the live-action Last of Us HBO show. The Last of Us live action is instantly a show that has so much respect for the fan base, so much respect for Naughty Dog, and so much respect for the original game itself. There was a decent amount that changed in the show, but it's the kind of changes that felt necessary, or a change that didn't feel like swallowing a big pill for. Seeing the day of the infection before it spread into chaos was a great decision. Making Bill go from a bitter hermit that had a miserable relationship with Frank into Bill still being a bitter hermit but having a really nice love story was a decision no one got mad at because the new version was so good. Having that shot stay on Ellie instead of it instantly cutting to black was such a small but great touch. The Head Ripper cameo was a fun moment for fans. Making Ellie's surgery be a cure instead of just a vaccine added more weight towards Joel's final decision. Seeing the original actor for Ellie be Ellie's mom felt like such a sweet passing of the torch moment. I could go on. The only complaint I have for the show was only because of my experience watching it. I watched it weekly, and I did enjoy the deep dive into other people's stories, but with the high-stake journey Joel and Ellie were on, it made me turn sour towards those episodes because I just wanted to see Joel and Ellie, specifically the episode where Joel gets stabbed and is in terrible condition. As the viewer, I am anxious for Joel and want to see how Ellie is able to prevent his death, but that episode turns into the Ellie backstory episode, which I know is a super important character moment for her, and it's relevant because Joel dying is a real possibility, so she's reminding herself about the first person she cares about dying. But I couldn't help but not give a shit because I cared more about the high-stakes scenario they were in the present. Besides my personal complaint of the show, The Last of Us was actually pretty good, and the reason I bring this up in comparison to Avatar is that it has a point to why it was made. A lot of people don't have a PlayStation. A lot of people have never played The Last of Us. A lot of people have never beaten The Last of Us. And a lot of people just don't play video games. So with this story becoming serialized, it opened up the floodgates to an actual new audience. But Avatar is a different story. So here's something that I feel gives a unique perspective on the matter. I've never seen the original Avatar. I watched the first season for this video, so everything I say is not tied in with nostalgia or goo-goo goggles at the original. Of course I can say I really liked the show, but I hope I am coming in with some objective opinions. So when it comes to the stuff that it kept, it technically kept a lot of stuff from the original story. It kept some of the same jokes, but it just was not as funny.
For without courage, how can we call ourselves men?
I gotta pee.
Some of you can't be trusted to stay at your posts. So from now on, 2 people at all times.
Pipsqueak, that's a funny name.
You think my name is funny?
Thanks, Pipsqueak.
He's the dude. I'm Pipsqueak.
It had Aang's childlike behavior, but it was ridiculously forced. You could sum that up to a poor performance from the actor, but Aang is the main character. You really gotta pay attention to that genuine likability as the director. They were pretty faithful to the Boomy episode, except they revealed he was Boomy way too soon. Instead of this sense of fear we could have from Aang being challenged by this crazy king, the Boomy reveal later on would release some tension and then some confusion to why he's doing all of this. But he tells Aang all of this before the challenges even start. So we're more frustrated than confused at Boomy the entire episode because we know who he is and why he is doing this. Personally, it's moments like this that make me think the writers have so many genuine fumbles with such a simple story that really makes me lose faith. But you see what I mean? They technically keep a lot of stuff, and yes, they can change it however they want to, but even the material they wanted to copy one for one is just a worse version of a joke or moment or scene. When it came to the stuff they did change, the real test that would give me faith in these writers is how they would portray the face stealer. And well,
It was something about stealing the face of someone you love.
But you know all about stealing, don't you?
in the original he has such little screen time but is so memorable. The genuine fear in the room with this thing was portrayed perfectly, and the face stealer itself is such a cooler creature in the original. The fact that we don't even see his methods of stealing faces is so much scarier than just seeing a spider person that happens to steal faces. It's a general rule with horror that the more ambiguous the threat is, the scarier they tend to be because we fear what we don't understand. The only reason I remember the face stealer in this show is because I have the original to compare it to. If this was an original story, I wouldn't be intimidated by this version. What the writers had to convey was mystery, tension, morbidness, and subtlety, but they ended up having some tension, no mystery, no morbidness, and no subtlety. If they couldn't nail a creature or scene with those qualities, then I know they're not going to portray a lot of things in the right way. One thing that sounds like a good idea to change but just felt lackluster was introducing the Fire Lord and Azula way too soon. Their scenes were fine, it didn't ruin the show or anything, but in comparison to the original, where you don't even see the Fire Lord, but you see how far out his power reaches, sets up such a cooler tone for the world. You see the influence on the people, the Fire Nation patrols in villages, the mentions of the Fire Lord like it's a name you shouldn't mention. They created this enigma out of the Fire Lord, and showing him off doesn't change much, but they had the chance to really hype up a big challenge for Aang in the future that wasn't entirely humanized and more hyped up through legend and power. They made a pretty big change with Katara in this show that I feel like missed the mark so hard. In episode 9 from the original show, Katara and Aang are trying to practice and learn some waterbending tricks, and Aang is instantly way better at it than her. So acting with pure jealousy and feeling inferior, she steals a waterbending scroll because of her desire of wanting to be a better bender. Of course, she learns her lesson in the end, but it added a flavor to Katara. She's a perfectionist with whatever she wants to do in her life. She wants to be the best she can be, and she had to learn how to control that passion inside of her. Meanwhile, in the live action, her grandma just gives her the scroll, added nothing to her character, literally just handing her this ability rather than showing a struggle or growth to get to that point in her skills or personality. And she desperately needed that. Katara's actor is incredibly wooden and spends the majority of the time just existing in the scene, or just speaking very monotone and super quiet. When a scene calls for certain types of emotions, she's able to do it, but if the scene just requires her to act normal, she will have the most neutral, boring performance. With all these plot points removed, it did get rid of some character depth, some world building, some mystery, and build up, but this change I'm about to say is why I think this show was doomed to fail. Aang in the original had so much charm with his optimistic enthusiasm and just wanting to have fun, learning lessons like ego control about being the Avatar, how true responsibility is when you have to tack it on even if you don't want to, coming to terms that his abilities are incredibly powerful and that scares him. Aang, just in the first season, had learned so much about himself and what it means to be the Avatar through real life experience. In the live action, Aang doesn't want the responsibility, but accepts it. From then on out, he learns it's okay for the Avatar to have friends like 3 different times because they don't know what to do with him after accepting the responsibility. I'm not joking.
I'll have to figure this out myself.
That is part of the journey.
After Kyoshi told me that I need to figure things out on my own, that it was part of my journey.
I hope that you're able to save your friends, but the truth is, for the Avatar, friends can be a liability.
I haven't learned any of the other bending skills, and I'll probably continue messing up, but at least I'll be able to do it with my friends by my side.
The Avatar must walk alone.
They all said that I need to do this by myself.
This is the past. Now, only one person can tell you the future. The person who'll write the legend of Aang.
Besides the inner conflict Aang didn't go through, he doesn't even learn a waterbending. That is the point of the show. He has to master all 4 elements in a handful of months while only being 12 years old. There's the conflict. There's some obvious urgency that they clearly love to have, and they don't even do that. You know, something beautiful happened while I was watching this show. All of my past criticisms washed away, and I realized this show is pure dog shit. This show is just painfully mediocre. Yes, I was watching the show, but I was scrolling on my phone while watching it 30% of the time because the dialogue is all fluff and repeats itself over and over again. The acting is hammed up and wooden.
You were right. Shut up and gloat later. Right now, we need to stop Sai. Jet planted a bomb on him.
The costume design is pretty good, except all the armor looks more like plastic and rubber rather than leather and metal. The fight scenes fucking suck because they keep cutting to a different angle every 2 seconds, so it ends up being genuinely jarring and hard to watch. Every scene that tries to demand tension with the constant cuts and generic intense music or unnecessary slow motion ends up being so tensionless.
buzzer should have expired right now. The game is over. She hasn't moved. What is that? Who does that? We're about 10 seconds past the buzzer now. 45 seconds after the buzzer.
It's really sad that the show from 20 years ago understood the meaningful thought process towards cutting to a new shot. The sets could have been interesting, but the reality of bringing these vibrant cities to live action sucks it down to a painfully bland normalcy that removes any distinct cultural designs. It also doesn't help that it's all a glob of big CGI cities that aren't pretty. The biggest reason why I believe this show failed at its job is the journey. You can technically say with the original that there's a decent amount of filler, but those episodes had lessons attached to it that affected Aang, Sokka, Katara, and Zuko in one way or another. I understand no one would like an exact remake of the show into live action, but the format of the original supported the narrative so much more. The live action boils it down to its most essential story beats, leaving no room for anything else. That doesn't sound too bad, but imagine if any of the Lord of the Rings were boiled down to the most essential story beats. That would end up being an hour and a half to 2 hour movie. Or in Breaking Bad, the most essential story beats would end up being 5 episodes out of the 10 episode seasons, and any growth from the characters would feel rushed or out of nowhere. It's about the journey. All of the small issues that come with the adventure add more to the characters. Seeing them in a more casual environment creates a contrast to how they act in a serious high-stake environment. It develops their moral code, adds flavors to their fighting styles, and their personality when they're not on high alert. With all these characters that we know so well from the original, it's very hard to get to know these characters because they only have like 2 attributes in this version. Aang went from a whimsical, immature, considerate, easygoing monk to a kid relearning what it means to be the Avatar several times. Katara went from a perfectionist caretaker full of determination with an adventurous spirit and a no-nonsense attitude to some girl with a dead mom that wants her brother to stop treating her like a kid. Sokka went from a braggadocious dork that has a childlike perception on gender roles that were caused from a lack of a father figure in his growing years to a phony warrior straight man archetype. And finally, Zuko went from a cold-hearted, hot-headed, determined, calculated fighter that played by his own rules to a zesty little bad boy. When it comes to adaptations, I completely embrace change, but at the end of the day, if it isn't an improvement to the original story, then why make it? I'm sure everyone heard that the original writers left the show because of creative differences, and we clearly see now what those differences were, and whoever was in charge here failed at their job on almost every aspect for old fans and new. Besides basing it on the original, this is just a genuinely poorly written show. There is no room for subtlety, no room for letting actions speak for themselves. In the first episode, Aang is voicing the issues he sees with being the Avatar. It kind of comes out of nowhere, and no 12-year-old would understand themselves like this. It's clearly lazy exposition that is informing the audience who Aang is and why he isn't happy with being the Avatar.
I know who I am. I like to play airball and eat banana cakes and goof off with my friends. That's who I am.
Too on the nose, bad delivery, and not a great intro to the main character. Meanwhile, in the original, all we needed to hear to understand Aang was,
"Will you go penguin sledding with me?" Sure.
Even in the scenes that are screaming for subtlety, it still needs to make sure the audience understands what's going on.
Working with no support in a forgotten little corner of the world, and yet he found the Avatar. I've always admired how you manage your commanders.
Zhao didn't discover the Avatar, Zuko did. He's the one who displayed resilience and dedication. That's what I expect from a future heir, not self-serving flattery and coy whispers.
A thing that thrives in the original is that, yes, this is a fantasy world, but it has a grounded historical tone that plays out in a real time of war. Wise people are genuinely wise, grizzled army men are genuinely grizzled, rebels had to morally compromise to try and win the safety for their people, loyalists under a faction didn't always believe what their nation was doing was the right thing, and not everyone lays their cards on the table with what their goals are. Yes, it's a kid's show, but that was no excuse for the writers to add in a lot of maturity and real stake. The live action show leans way more into the safe fantasy style we've seen over and over again. I truly believe the only difference on a maturity level is that they're allowed to kill people rather than insinuate casualties. Besides that, everything feels so phony. The scenes that were supposed to have a grounded tone with high stake or big heart are very soulless. Just look at the difference between the Gyatso reveal. In the live action, we do see him die in just a generic way of defending himself. Then Aang sees his skeleton, gets sad. In the original, I don't even have to say anything. anything. This paints such a great picture to what happened here. Yes, the answer is show don't tell, but you also have to carefully craft what you're showing, and the original Avatar does that fantastically. The only way the live action uses show don't tell is when character want cry, but is not cry. Aww. Hold on, stop. This show fucked up. You wanna know why? I just saw Dune 2. Listen, I know it's wrong to compare these two stories, but they are both adaptations after all. What can I say? Finishing the live action Avatar, then seeing Dune 2 has put myself into a new perspective. Denis actively understands the intention of Frank Herbert's work, and from what I hear, the Dune books are very unconventional with its dialogue and action to the point of alienating a lot of people. But Denis has turned it into something universally appraised. This Avatar show had a budget of $120 million, and Dune 2 had a budget of $190 million. Granted, that $70 million creates a massive difference, but it's just so obvious here that the minds behind the Avatar show have no creative vision, no talent, and an undaring skill set. They have a misguided mindset as to why they think this show is popular. Avatar isn't a kid show. It's a show about a kid. I'm not saying that their solution was to have a grizzled, grounded tone like Dune 2, because they technically are trying to set that tone of grizzled wartime depression with fantasy elements, but they genuinely were not talented enough. You know, one time I sat through a seminar with the main speaker being a writer who has written for big production companies before, and he went into all the aspects of being a writer's assistant or the story editor, but when he was taking questions, I asked him, what are the aspects of being a writer, being the person who comes up with the story? He chuckled and said, your only job is to be frickin' brilliant, and everyone around you has to let you be frickin' brilliant, or else you're gonna get more on your plate and you can't focus on being friggin' brilliant. So when I think of a project like both Dune movies, literally every facet of it is friggin' brilliant. The world building, the characters, the acting, the cinematography, the CGI, the costume and makeup, the music, what they kept from the books, what they changed from the books. It's all genuinely amazing work, filled with so much passion and attention to detail. So when I finished Dune 2 and I was glossing over some scenes from the Avatar live action for this video, I couldn't help but think the show was 10 times worse from when I originally watched it. Maybe my standards have raised now, but I have to say, there's no excuse. They had an amazing budget to do whatever they wanted. They had a beloved IP that would guarantee millions of views, all the opportunity to really make a name for yourself as a writer, director, choreographer, or cinematographer, and usher in these younger actors that could go on and have outstanding careers. But what did it end up doing? Disagreed with the original creators so much that they went their separate ways, had painfully phony acting, terrible direction, predictably boring cinematography, and somehow taking this pre-written, exciting, newish story that is close to so many people's hearts and turning it into a safe, mundane, overdramatic, and unnecessary show that no one will prefer when the original is sitting right there. At the end of the day, an adaptation needs to be made with heart. I feel like I speak for a lot of people when I say, I am so tired of these studios taking advantage of fan bases. Once something becomes viral, the first thought out of these execs is how to monetize it. Look at when iCarly got rediscovered on TikTok back in 2020. Paramount instantly hopped on to make it again, but when it came out a year later, no one gave a shit, so they canceled it after 3 seasons because it was a desperate ploy at cashing in on a fad. Same thing with Avatar. It got rediscovered by a younger audience in 2021, and a few years later, they remade it into something no one asked for. Like I said with The Last of Us, there felt like a demographic that would have never experienced this story if it was not in a serialized format. With Avatar, who's the demographic that would have never experienced this story? People who don't watch cartoons? You can make anything from an original source and turn it into something amazing or something terrible. It all depends on the vision you have. Look at David Fincher with The Killer. That was based on a comic book, and the storyline of The Killer movie was just the first act of that comic. Is it a faithful adaptation? Not entirely, but it was a creative decision from David, and it ended up being a way more coherent movie. There's Ready Player One, where in the book it had a complex nostalgia trip with interesting storylines, relationships, and stakes. The book is a slow burn, but when the pieces come together, it makes you feel like you're finding the Easter eggs with your own pop culture knowledge alongside the main character. The movie, while an enjoyable piece by itself, takes the complexities of the search for the keys and turns it into a more simple task. Albeit fun for the common viewer, but there are more serious points in the book, like murdering of one of the main characters and disgusting cover-ups from the company, that I feel like should have been included. Ernest Cline did mention the challenges were changed for pacing, so I guess it's alright.
Skibbity Riz, Ohio, yeah. Phantom Tex.
You guys with all my heart.
There's Zack Snyder's DC universe that is a source material that is constantly being stared at with how accurate it must be. Zack clearly didn't understand these characters and the moral complexities that come with something as lame as he thought Batman's no killing rule was, but it was his own adaptation. He thought he could do something different and crowd pleasing, but it backfired in the mainstream. There is a diehard fan base of Zack Snyder fans for some reason, so at least he's cultivated a style and community out of it. Or the opposite could happen. The original material could be so fucking bad, but the adaptation enhances it into a more coherent and thought out story. So many things can happen as long as you have heart, as long as you have a vision, and as long as you have a purpose, then you can't help but make the adaptation on par with the original story at least. When you sign up for an adaptation, there are those series of rules you have to keep in mind, but at the end of the day, you just gotta be freaking brilliant.